Right. Well, thank you for joining this talk. Yeah, apologies to the coordinators and hosts. I was having a little trouble with my internet. So finally I made it, and hopefully for the next hour, it's gonna work. Otherwise, I'll have to run and get my phone and try to use the data off the phone. Plan B. So I'm Deborah McGregor, and I'm from Whitefish River First Nation. I'm Anishinaabe. I work at York University and I'm an associate professor there and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice. My work, the work that I'm going to talk about today, actually primarily is work I do in First Nation communities. I always call it my different lives. There's like me as a person and who I am and my responsibilities as a result of that. Then there's like professionally working in First Nation communities, because I did that before I was in the academic world. I continue to do that even when I'm there. And then there's the academic stuff. So I'm going to be reflecting a lot on what I've learned from different elders and knowledge holders over probably the last 25 years, when I really started to pay attention more to water governance, water security in First Nations. And prior to my PhD was in forestry, so that's what I was doing until I was asked to engage in this kind of work. So I have a PowerPoint, and mostly I do because it just keeps me on track, because this is like 25 years worth of work. And I get pretty excited about this topic. So it's really to discipline me. That's why I have to do it. And hopefully, I'm trying to see if it says can people see this? People can now see your application. Okay, good. All right, what we didn't check was what's starting. So I wanted to talk about what I'm going to call an Indigenous ontology of water. Ontology is a fancy word for how Indigenous people, more specifically in Anishinaabe, I clearly cannot talk on behalf of all Indigenous people in the world, in Canada, or even in Ontario, and what that relationship looks like and what the implications are by having a different type of ontologist means what we consider to be real. What's real to First Nations people around water? What kind of implications does it have in terms of water governance and water security? So one of the first things I learned in working with elders was, and it kind of surprised me, and I was unsure as why I didn't know this growing up in the community that I did, was that women have a particular relationship and responsibility in relation to water. So I chose this image to represent that. I really like it. So you can just look at something other than teeny little black boxes all over a screen. So where does it start? So what is this? Where does the First Nation view and understanding and relationship of coexistence in relation to water come from? For us, it starts with creation stories. Our creation stories tell us about what our relationships are, what those appropriate relationships are supposed to be with the natural world, including water, what our responsibilities are. It's not just knowing about it, it's also what are our responsibilities, understanding what our responsibilities are. A lot of that comes through our creation story. But even with the Anishinaabe, there's like so many different creation stories. There isn't just like one story. It can change geographically, but the intention of them is the same. Who are we in this place? What are our obligations? What are our responsibilities? How are we supposed to relate to each other and the natural world? And what's become very clear is it always begins with spirit. So when I'm part of coordinating water gatherings in First Nation communities, there's always a water ceremony. It always starts in a ceremonial context. And this is insisted upon by the folks that we are that we're working with. This acknowledgement that we are that the root of our conversation should be rooted in spirit and spirituality. That is bigger than us. The idea is that it's not just humans sitting around talking. It's like what we're talking about is way bigger than us as people. So it's often trying to convey humility. So I always like to say this: for thousands of years, we've been living, we passed on knowledge resulting in sustainable relationships with all of creation. So when I say this, I'm not saying we are perfect. We certainly weren't. We had stories where people were not living in balance with the natural world or with each other. And in those stories, there is creation, destruction, and then recreation. So we go through this process of recreation. Probably one of the most familiar stories to people in Ontario anyway, because it's similar in the Haudenosaunee tradition as well as the Anishinaabeg, is the recreation story with Sky Woman. That's a recreation story after a flood. So we learn from when we make these big mistakes, and then we recreate a world. And water is usually central in a lot of those stories. So we had this knowledge that's been around for thousands and thousands of years. So this is sort of the kind of boring academic part. But many of you are probably familiar. Water crisis. This is being drawn from the World Water Reports. They come out World Water Day, March 22nd. Well, maybe there's probably 10 or more reports. Maybe they started around 2010 or so, 12. And basically, they've been indicating there's a water crisis. They all have different themes. So this is a huge situation that's facing people on the planet and being exacerbated by climate change. So this understanding that water is important to everybody. It's not just important to Indigenous peoples or First Nations peoples. So part of Indigenous realities around this is in terms of how Indigenous peoples were relating to water, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation, is nation states. So if we're in Canada, that's Canada. There's people from other geographic jurisdictional areas as part of this conversation. So you're going to find, nation states are asserting their sovereignty and jurisdiction in relation to water, and that's had negative impacts on Indigenous peoples. And from our point of view, they've been also grossly mismanaged. So, which is why we end up with a global water crisis. And in Canada, First Nations people experience water, not the only ones. There's probably going to be, I suppose, more of that now with the climate change situation in places. Either there's going to be flooding, or there's fires, like there's or drought. So people are going to be impacted by their access and water security, and increasingly so. But from our point of view, we've been alienated through other colonizing and imperialist and capitalist forces from relating to the water in the way that we would have for thousands of years. Really, as an Anishinaabe person, for really most of my nation's history, this nation states asserting their sovereignty over waters is more recent, 150 years or so, compared to the thousands of years. And from our point of view, it's been grossly mismanaged. And partly that the root of that is because there's a different understanding and view and way of relating to water that isn't represented in laws and governance and policies around water. Oh, I don't know. All of a sudden it's not changing. Oh, here we go. So because I always say, well, I can't represent the view of Indigenous peoples all over the world, what I tend to turn to are Indigenous declarations, where Indigenous peoples have come together, different nations from all over the world, and talked about water. And often there'll be 3 different declarations I'll show you here. That's where you see similarities. So some areas I'm pretty comfortable because they got together and this is what the people who gathered came up with. And usually it's coinciding with the World Water meetings, and Indigenous peoples because they're not nation states or recognized as such, or even as societies, but populations are excluded from a lot of the decision making. So we end up having to be on the outside looking in and putting forward our own view, our own ontology and relationship in terms of water. And I'm not going to read it to you, but this is just sort of one example where water is understood to be a sacred gift. And this is the Kyoto Water Declaration of 2003. This is another declaration, 2006, relating, again, water to material, cultural, and spiritual life. So again, a different view and understanding of water. And because these other people are making decisions about water that aren't necessarily, well, they're not the way we would make decisions about water, people are calling for the recognition of our own knowledge and ways and traditions around how we would relate to water based on our own worldview and ontology. Another declaration: the Indigenous peoples also have responsibilities and obligations in relation to water, and we have laws. We have our own laws around water, and there's work going on around the world, I think, by different Indigenous people. They're starting to document and codify what those laws are, so that other people can understand them. So water is not a commodity; it is a spirit that has a right to be treated as an ecological entity with its own right to exist. So this is important. So there's a broader ontology. So everyone has an ontology. We just don't call it that. Sees water differently. Sees water as a commodity. So policies and laws and plans are going to recognize and relate to water as a commodity as opposed to spirit. You can see how that would be quite different. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also thinks about water differently, like thinks about not like our that we're going to govern water, like that's assuming a hierarchy where humans are above and water's below, and it's this resource and commodity that we have to manage, but that we actually have responsibilities in relation to water, and to ensure future generations can also continue on with those relationships to water. So it's framed in terms of responsibility, even in a declaration that's focused on rights. Water and human rights. I thought I would mention this because there's different dimensions to people or humans in water. And for Indigenous peoples, it's rights. UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. What rights do we have? In Canada, it's part of treaties, Aboriginal and treaty rights. There's also human rights. All humanity needs water to live. But I always find, then one of the reasons why I mentioned this, because part of an Anishinaabe ontology is you need water to live. And to me, that would just be such a no-brainer. But it was finally in 2010 where it was recognized as being a human right, that people would need water. So I always look at it as the United Nations is finally catching up to what Anishinaabe and other Indigenous peoples have known all along. Like we already had laws that would have recognized this. Again, in 2011 furthering that agenda, and largely because people are not getting access to water. So it's part of rights, human rights, and also part of Indigenous rights. And there's another narrative that's becoming, it's probably too strong of a word to say common, but it's certainly there and maybe emerging a little bit more, is the rights of nature, rights of water, the personhood of nature, personhood of water. So the legal personhood of water starting to become recognized in different jurisdictions. Just some examples. One in Canada is in the Magpie River in, I believe, Labrador, in a new territory. So it's becoming a way that what people are trying to do with this is having people think about and relate to water differently beyond the water as a commodity resource paradigm. So there's different views emerging in terms of how one understands and relates to water as a person, as a human. So ontologies of water. So I'm finally getting there. I forgot to bring my phone, so I'm not even keeping track of time here. So hopefully someone will discipline me in terms of time. So I was trying to manage myself here. Ontologies of water. So one of the things I learned, and you see your image, this is like where I come from Whitefish River First Nation. One is winter and one is the summer. And where there's snow and where there's H2O, water in its liquid form. And to me, I wanted to show you that because when I was doing work on developing a source water protection plan at the community level, water was understood so differently. Water wasn't just water coming out of a tap, which is what, let's say, the province of Ontario source water protection plans focus on. It was water as people understand it way more broadly. Water was snow, water was ice, water took many different forms that people wanted to be included as part of their source water protection plan that you don't see in other source water protection plans. So that's why I showed that people think about water way more broadly when you're coming from a different ontology in relation to water. I'm not going to read this. The nature of water. So this is Judith Wolkin out of BC. So it doesn't. So a lot of the efforts around trying to protect water, which you need to do. Canada creating the Canadian Water Agency, because there hasn't really been a lot of coordination, believe it or not, federally around water. Generally, it was a provincial responsibility. But water's not like that. Water kind of flows, and water's kind of does its own thing. It's already there, and trying to superimpose these administrative jurisdictional authorities and laws created by people, which actually doesn't recognize the nature of water, was sort of one of the points that she was trying to make here, that you'd want to start, or from a First Nation point of view, from the actual nature of water itself, rather than trying to superimpose, these jurisdictions on top of water, because water has moves, and I guess its life world is different than what a lot of these administrative structures are how they're being employed to try to protect water. Nebe is sort of how Anishinaabeg referred to water. It's the translation. So water ontologies, Nebe ontologies. So this came from this work that we did in Ontario with different knowledge holders and elders and practitioners, people who are hunting and trapping and on the land. And we engaged in different gatherings and conversations with people from different groups, from different nations and societies, because even in Ontario, it's quite diverse. BC is very diverse, and brought them together and had conversations around water. The project was funded, actually, I think, federally and provincially, around, a few years after the Walkerton the Walkerton situation, where people died, and then there was an inquiry afterwards. So there was this sort of recognition, we need to start thinking about water and protection in more systematic ways, and there needs to be policy and laws in place to protect water. And what we were being asked to do, this project was through the Chiefs of Ontario, so this other life other than the academic life that I have, and to talk to people about what source water protection would look like in First Nation communities. What was interesting was people kind of rejected that idea. Like, they just said, really what we try to do is coexist with water, and we try to, and the way they understood it was, the title of the report, which I think you can still find online, is called Taking Care of Water. They didn't like the language of source water protection. It tends to be a very technical exercise. Really, they were kind of drawing on traditional knowledge and had a different framing of how to approach this. And that's what the title of the report. We look at it as more like how we take care of a relative, how we take care of somebody that we know. It's not like we're trying to govern and superimpose our will upon water. So there was time to get into all that came out of that work, but water, some characteristics came out of it, like that, talk about Indigenous ontologies. Water was seen as a relative. Again, you're taking care of, you're relating to. It's a reciprocal kind of relationship. You have responsibilities to a relative. We need to care for water. Women and girls have a special connection to water, because our first environment that we're in is water, and water precedes us before we're born. So a lot of the ceremonial responsibilities for water women hold in Anishinaabe communities. Anyway, this isn't the same everywhere. People have different traditions around this, and have to be safe and well with water. There's a dualism to water. Water's main responsibility is to support life. Everything needs water. When humans are off in other planets trying to find life there, they're looking for water, right? But there's a duality too. If you don't treat water well, you're disrespectful, you're contaminating, you're destroying water, you're damming it, then it can be harmful to you. We can drink contaminated water and get sick, when really what water wants to do is to be able to support life. So we look at it in terms of responsibilities. Here, I just want to acknowledge the late Josephine Mondamen's work to raise awareness about First Nation understandings of water. She walked around all the Great Lakes, like she's like an elder, like 65 plus, doing this in order to do that. And again, part of what she was saying as part of her work was water has also experienced trauma by what people are doing to it, contaminating, polluting, stopping the flow of water, doing sort of throwing fluent out into the water from pulp and paper mills and mining and such. So she was actually not only trying to raise awareness, but also trying to help water, trying to heal water in the work that she was doing. And to me, she started a movement, raised a lot of people's awareness, particularly in First Nation communities. We look at water as being also a teacher. We learn from water. So it isn't just water to come out of the tap so we can get a drink of water or take a shower, or whatever it is that people generally think about in relation to water. Water is also understood to be a teacher to us. It isn't just, this in my glass. In fact, even when I'm in meetings now in a First Nation context around water, we always have water present in glass. So that we're also talking to water, not just talking about water. So that's actually even in highly political kind of meetings where that is respected and understood, that water is also a teacher to us. Just different forms of water. So my family has a maple sugar camp, so we make water. And so it's sweet water, and it comes at a time of major food insecurity. So it's like really important to us, ceremonies around this. And it's understood to be a gift from the natural world to us in order to survive. So water can take different forms. So what is water? So to compare ontologies, because I started to think about this, we'd be sitting around the table working with Chiefs of Ontario and a lot of these political kind of environments I would be in, and we'd be saying the word water, but we meant different things by saying the word water. And we're all kind of interested in, we want to protect water or take care of water, but we're meaning something different. So this is what you'll find in the dictionary. It doesn't say anything about life or being a relative or all those things I talked about that come out in conversations and dialogue and work with First Nations and water. It doesn't mean water isn't this. It's just not only this. So what I try to make clear when I'm relying on these kind of definitions is this is true, but it's not the only thing that's true. A whole bunch of other things are true. The true is bigger than what we see here in terms of what we're talking about in relation to water. That's what you'll see. That's what water is. And then you talk to First Nations people, elders, and they understand water to be different. They're different than that. So water, this is work drawing upon M.A. Craft, who does a lot of work on water governance, documenting Anishinaabe laws around water. Because all these laws exist, but they're not necessarily written down. A lot of times they're not. So you have to figure out how you're going to adequately represent them, but then codify them and document it so other people can understand what they are. And I'll talk about some of the research that she's done and what some of the findings are. So when people want to protect water through Western legal traditions, water is understood to be a very specific thing, like that definition, an object or a subject to be owned or used. For Anishinaabe, the Indigenous legal relationship is based on basis of spirit. Again, like I said, even like if we're meeting with government people, they have to respect that a ceremony is going to take place, and they're welcome to participate in it if they wish. So spiritual law is the first formal law from which all other legal understanding comes from, is what M.A. Craft finds in the work that she's doing. I just wanted to show you this. I mean, I'm citing a World Water Report from 2013, but I have an image of 2017 because I couldn't find the 2013 one. But it was the first time I started to read the World Water Reports, and where it started to, it took a while for it to dawn on me, like, we're talking about water so differently here. And I kept looking for like some kind of Indigenous understanding as part of these reports, and I didn't find it. I think in one of the more recent ones, sometimes a couple of places they mention cultural understanding, but they don't really go there. They're really sticking with the technical dictionary definition of water. And here they talk about water also as being a resource. A lot of the times in the doc, I did do a review of them at one point to kind of see what the ontology of water was in the World Water Development Reports. So M.A. Craft's work, you can find her work in the Decolonizing Water website or the Treaty 3 organization. So it's Indigenous or Anishinaabe water laws called Anishinaabe and Okanaganwan. So some of the laws that flow from the work that she's done, that is she's based some other work on, is water as spirit. I'm not going to read these. You can read them. But what I wanted to point out to you is, based on this Treaty 3, led by the Women's Council there, they developed their own declaration. That was sort of how they decided to kind of codify or write down some of the laws. They also have a toolkit they have videos and they're developing curriculum, because part of it is trying to revitalize this in First Nation communities ourselves, but also trying to teach other people who are on our lands and territories who aren't treating from our point of view water properly. How do you start teaching them? How do we start engaging in a conversation? What kind of resources do they also need? Try to understand. So you can find a lot of these resources. So I wanted to kind of point that out, that this work is taking place. We're figuring out how to document and codify it so it can be more accessible so people can understand. So feel free to look for it. I'm not doing the word justice in the 2 minutes that I spent on this slide. What does water justice look like? So this was sort of the research that I've been doing for many years. Water is a being, an entity, with rights and responsibilities. So I mentioned this, water's responsibility to support life. We should be able to count on water to be able to do that. And when water is contaminated, like bad things happen to water by people, then water's not going to be able to fulfill those responsibilities. A lot of the solutions and responses don't recognize that, as I pointed out before. Even in something like the World Water Report, it's a very singular ontology of water in there, very specific view and understanding of water. And in Canada, the way that dealing with the First Nation water crisis in some of the communities is very techno-scientific fix. And I'm not saying it's not important. Obviously, putting a water treatment plant in a community is really important, but it's a very limited view in terms of how people understand and relate to water. They often don't deal with the damage that's already done. So again, a treatment plant, people can put whatever chemicals are required in there to make the water drinkable, but it doesn't deal with the actual source of where the contamination is, whether that's mining or whatever, pulp and paper mill stuff being thrown into the water or whatever. So again, how can water justice be achieved when you're thinking about water more broadly, have a different ontology of water? And this is just an iconic image developed by Anishinaabe artists around water that I really like. So we think about water as a gift. So how will we treat a gift? Like, you're going to think about a gift that comes to you from someone, how you're going to receive that gift, how you're going to take care of that gift differently than if you see something as a resource and you just take it. So water is offering its gifts, and we're recipients of that gift, and we're going to hopefully be respectful of the gift and not abuse the gift. So there's different ways then in terms of practices, how one starts to then relate to water. And so there's an image, an artist, I believe this is Christy Bellecourt, of offerings being made to water. So before you would go on the water, before you're using water, there's offerings made for recognition and sometimes permission for like crossing in dangerous places and such. So really, ultimately, from an Anishinaabe perspective, a lot of the times we're thinking about because it's a reciprocal relationship and a relationship based on coexistence, we think about what is our gift going to be to water. So if you were going to employ a different ontology to water, there being a resource, a commodity, then or a subject in law, is thinking about what is my gift going to be to water? Like what am I going to do to help water live its responsibilities? In one image, iconic image coming out of Mi'kmaq country, trying to protect water through defense. And one is a colleague of mine that I work with a lot, Sue Chiblo, who's who organized a lot of the water walk and continues to do so. So raising awareness, healing, ceremonial sort of aspect in relation to water. There's different ways that we might show what our gifts are going to be to water. So that's it for this presentation. So I know it's a lot of throwing that out at you, but hopefully it's enough to base a conversation on. And I didn't take too long with that. But I needed to have some sort of structure because I could go on for hours about this topic.